If 30 years ago someone told you that the most vital discussions and arguments and fights and even elections were being waged by conservatives in school board meetings, you'd be pretty surprised. But that's exactly where we are right now, and it's a very good thing. To prove me right, we've got Dr. Kevin Roberts of Heritage Foundation joining us again. Dr. Roberts, thank you again for being here. You are a professor. You've been steeped. You're a history.
I'm a recovering academic. I am a historian.
Go. So would you agree that really these front lines right now in school boards and fights over curriculum in state-run schools, this is where it's at for conservatives?
It is. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, I'm a fifth-generation teacher, was in the classroom as an early American history professor, and then left that about 15 years ago to get involved in education freedom and school choice. Mm-hmm. And I've been waiting for this day, along with a lot of people. And you know what's really telling about what's going on with the school board races and school board issues being the tip of the spear is it's a reminder for those of us who do policy for a living that our policy efforts are a lot easier when, from the grassroots bottom up, parents, many of whom are apolitical, decide we've had enough and it's time to change things. I'm very optimistic about not just these school board races, but that we're going to completely redesign American education, because right now, to sum up here, Larry, we're operating with a 170-year-old Horace Mann model of how you educate kids. It's the 21st century.
Oh, that's great. Okay, now we've got something.
Oh, I've got you going now.
No, yes, you do. Yes, you do. Because this whole idea of public schools, Horace Mann, I mean, let's educate people a little bit and give them that history lesson. Because I did the read. It's like, how did we get here? You look at other countries, England, right? England has a very different model with regard to their public education. When you look at how it was originally presented in America, one of the core elements of why we wanted a public school system that everybody bought into, and we said, okay, fine, let's use our tax dollars for it, but we'll be in charge because we're the citizenry and we're able to call the shots with the curriculum and all that. One of the things was we're going to educate our children, we're going to keep them healthy and give them physical fitness, and we're going to teach them to be good, patriotic citizens. The whole thing was sold to us on the idea that we've got to educate our kids so that they become patriotic, American-loving students. We've completely turned that around.
We have, and that part of the Horace Mann model worked for, 120 years? Mm-hmm. And so what I tell people over the last generation or two is not only are we getting worse at educating kids, the most recent study of our education achievement shows that American students have declined from being top 20 in the world to like 72nd. I mean, that should be an affront to any of us. Yeah. But to your point about patriotic education, we're no longer transmitting patriotic values from one generation to the next. That was one of the reasons that we started public schools to begin with.
We're transmitting the opposite. We're actually teaching children to hate our country, be suspicious of our country and its origins, and to grow up learning that we have a systemically racist, or put whatever word you want in there, a hateful nation that doesn't even have a right to exist.
That's right, and it started with students not even knowing American history. So about the time that I was getting into the classroom full time, about 20, 25 years ago, I knew from my colleagues, whether it was teachers when I was a K-12 teacher or in higher ed with professors, that they simply weren't teaching, for example, the founding principles of the United States. But then what's happened since then is something even worse. So it's bad enough, in other words, not to teach the founding of the United States, one of the most noble experiments in human history. But to your point, we've now stepped into that vacuum, or I should say, they have stepped into that vacuum with the exact opposite. And this is why, and you know I don't engage in hyperbole, basically American history and civics education is neo-Marxist in our very own country.
Yeah, and so when you say they, who were they? Was it a concerted effort? I mean, something definitely happened, and conservatives were not part of that conversation. We disengaged. We either took our state-run schools for granted, or I think, sadly, in some cases, some of the well-placed and wealthy conservatives in the country who donate to think tanks like Heritage Foundation and other activist groups, they said, well, you know what? My kids, they're in private school, so it doesn't affect them, so why should we worry about it? I hear that a lot. It's not my kids in that school, so why should I care?
I used to hear that a lot. Thankfully, more people are coming to the realization that after this generation of conservatives not paying attention, especially to curriculum and to teacher training, that has been at the peril, not just of students, but to the future of this country. And the people who really were the tip of the spear of that were these psychology and education professors, most of whom were Vietnam War protesters of the 60s, who got their doctorates in education. And then what did they do? They started training the next two generations of American school teachers. So as a fifth generation teacher, my younger brother is an English teacher in a public school in Louisiana. I always want to value the sacrifice they make. It's not them who are the origins of the problem, it's the people who train them. Therefore, if we want to fix this, we need to select all and delete almost every college of education in this country and rebuild them around this new vision of what education should be.
These are the teacher schools we hear about.
That's exactly
a lot. And Governor DeSantis in Florida got into some hot water. I don't know why. It was a perfectly reasonable idea. They have a teacher shortage down there. A lot of big states do. And he said, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to change the accreditation for a while. We're going to allow veterans who already have some accreditation and training and teaching, because when you're a veteran in the military, usually if you get to a certain rank, you're doing some training and teaching, right? We're going to let them into the classroom on a temporary basis while they get their teacher credentials. Everybody went nuts. But that seems perfectly reasonable. First of all, solving his problem, but also changing who's going to these schools and challenging their monopoly on the accreditation process.
I know that from my own anecdotal experience starting a K through 12 private school, where in every teaching position that I could, Larry, I hired someone who had no education hours. Why? Because we could teach those teachers how to teach, but we had a banker teaching mathematics. We had someone who actually had owned a small business teaching economics and higher order math. But then on a large scale, we know from our heritage research, something that we released recently called the Education Freedom Report Card, that students who are achieving well are in states where there is more education freedom, including, to your point, the freedom for people who've had other careers to be certified as a teacher without having to go to those colleges of education.
But ultimately, and you know, so many of these principles that we talk about in our country, they always boil down to free market, right? That always, like, things get better when there's competition. There is no competition right now in this realm. That's where school choice comes in. And I know there was a time when it was called the voucher system, and now it's school choice. But it's really about education freedom, where government money, instead of going directly into the institution, which is still the government, the money follows the child. The parents are able to take that money and then use it. It's sort of the college system that we have right now. Right?
It is. I mean, we've lived through this for 2 generations. It's worked well. At Heritage, at Heritage, when we're talking about policy changes, we start with the ideal. And the ideal is that every single dollar follow every single American child. In order to get there, over the next year or two, we need to see a lot more state legislatures passing universal school choice for the following reason. Let parents decide which school is best for their child. It may be a different school than what you and I would decide for our children, but that's the whole point. This is America, and we've gotten to the point where we're more interested in funding systems rather than students, and parents, thank goodness, over the last 2 years have stood up and said, we've had enough.
All right, Ronald Reagan ran in '81 saying that he wanted to do away with the Department of Education. And pretty much every Republican candidate for president has sort of echoed that. It's not happening. It hasn't happened. Is that still the goal and the ideal? And in the meantime, if Republicans get the majority next month, they're not going to get rid of the Department of Education, but should they start doing what Democrats do, which is, okay, we got a Department of Education, we're going to attach strings to those dollars. So you want to do CRT, you want to do the 1619 project, not with federal money.
We will not improve American education until we tear out, root and branch, every last dollar of the U.S. Department of Education and sunset it by the end of this decade. Therefore, for what looks like a conservative majority coming into Congress next year, Heritage looks forward to being their accountability partner, to start block granting some of that money to get the states more accustomed to making more decisions. And when we're thinking about these big goals, perhaps in 5 or 6 years, we can sit down and say, we did it. We got rid of the Department of Education.
Do you remember when we first met when you just started at Heritage?
I do.
You had a few people come in and we started bouncing ideas around, and it was my turn to ask you a question. And I started to ask you about education and about the school board fights that are happening in the Washington. I couldn't even get the question out. I kid you not. I'm vouching for Dr. Roberts here. He jumped in and said, I got you, Larry. We're on it.
Did I interrupt you?
You did. You jumped right in the middle of the sentence and said, we're on it. You can count on Heritage on this thing. And well, so far it looks pretty good.
We're making great headway. We've got a lot to do in this country, but I'm optimistic. I know it's a time when your audience might say, I don't have a lot of hope for America. I think we're turning the corner, and it really does start with taking back education.
Optimism. Well, we'll take a little dose of that right now. Keep it here. More to come on O'Connor Tonight.